Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. I recently took a trip to Brian Head, Utah, which is the tallest spot where there are people hanging out in Utah, and it was the height of summer, so it made for a great jumping off point to visit Bryce and Zion and some areas around there. But one of the things that came up while I was on the trip was thinking about the nature of fear, and there are many different ways to deal with this when this arises, but I wanted to share some thoughts and insights that really kind of came up and crystallized while I was on this trip. So in the serendipity that often happens, I had stopped for sunset at Cedar Breaks National Monument. So there's this magnificent multicolored dip in the ground that's filled with, beautiful rocks and trees. And the light of sunset is making all kinds of wonderful colors. And as I was leaving, I ran into some people, and one of the women said, "Hey, aren't you going to stay for the rise of the Milky Way?" And I was like, wow, that wasn't even on my radar, but I'm at this really high elevation. It's a dark area, so very, very little human light is being created. And it happened that the sky was really clear, no clouds in the sky, and we were on the new moon. So I was like, oh, wow, epic stargazing opportunity. And so I went back and had dinner and, bundled up and headed back out. And it was just really interesting to kind of be with the experience. I was definitely in a different environment, and it was an experience that was transcendently wonderful in terms of the epicness of the Milky Way and the stars and the night sky, and when my eyes adjusted, being able to see the silhouettes of the things around me. And it was also edgy because I was on a solo trip and I was out in a dark, unfamiliar environment alone. And I'm often out in the dark alone. I have a hot tub on my property and I tend to go out in the evening and stargaze, but that's a really familiar kind of environment. So I have a good sense of what's going to happen. And this was out in a theoretically public place. The parking lot was completely deserted, and I made the choice to take my little chair and walk out to the viewpoint. So I had this really dark, open experience of looking at the stars. And as I settled in, I had my flashlight to hand so that I could turn on, light at a moment's notice. And I was self-coaching, like, okay, I really am out here alone. I can kind of sort of see now that my eyes have adjusted to the dark. I would hear someone if they were walking up and, so on and so forth. And I was just really wanting to drop in and have a deeper experience, but there was this part of me in the back of my mind that was anxious and a little bit tense about, is this a good idea? Is this safe? And I made a spontaneous choice to do something that was really unusual for me. So going out into the dark night in an unfamiliar location isn't something that I get up to all the time. So usually when I've done stargazing, I have taken friends with me, which is lovely, but I didn't happen to have any friends handy, so solo experience it was. And I'd happened to be at the visitor center a day or two before, and someone was asking, are there bears in the area? And the person said, we haven't seen bears around here in years and years. I'm like, oh, okay, no bears. So I'm sitting in the dark, and my brain is coming up with what could the threat be? So it suggested a human. And I'm like, well, if there are no humans, and here's how I could know if there was a human. And then I obviously dismissed bears out of hand because I already had up-to-date information about the absence of bears. And so the next thing my brain threw up on the screen of my mind was the idea of a cougar. And what if there's a mountain lion? And it kind of cracked me up because I could really follow the thread of having oh my goodness, I don't remember the last time I saw stars like this. The Milky Way is so clear. It's just absolutely, utterly stunning. And I get to have this experience between earth and sky that is just so my jam, like really, really magnificent. And then this other part of me that was like, hey, I have tension around this. And so it was just really funny because I'm trying to self-coach myself out of the, dangers of mountain lion. Well, not very many people have a problem. And there's a whole lot of territory that doesn't just totally smell like humans because we've been, driving in here. They want to eat deer anyway. There are abundant deer in the area. You've seen a number of them. There's even roadkill nearby. Like you're fine. And yet, in my mind's eye in the dark, there was this potential. And so I sat with the tension for a while, and then I pivoted and I gathered up my stuff and I went back to the car. So then I sat in the car for a while and looked at the stars, which was not the epic immediacy of not looking through the windshield. And then I got out next to my car and I looked at the stars for a while, and the tension was kind of coming up. And then I was back in my car. And all in all, I had a absolutely delightful experience and went back and was just really glad that I had come out and done the thing. And what I was reflecting on, and there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do this, but I think it's worthwhile to think about how you navigate fear. So I can really understand why my instincts were freaking out at being in an unfamiliar place and a really dark night all alone. Like in terms of hunter-gatherer survival, it's just not a super good plan. If you are somebody who has cats and you've ever moved your cat from one home to another home, you'll be aware of this time where the cats go around kind of hunched down with their heads on swivel, just trying to figure out in this new place if there's anything that eats cats that they need to worry about. And then, after they've had some time, they stop hiding under the bed and claim the space as their own and find the most luxurious places to lay and the best cat TV to look out the window and all that good stuff. But initially, they're in an unfamiliar environment, and our brains really have that relationship. And part of why I love solo travel so much is it does kick my brain out of power saver mode, because I don't know everything. I don't know the stop signs on the road. I don't know the flow of traffic. I don't know the, 3 places I prefer to eat at that are available. So I'm taking in everything. I'm learning about the road and the different routes and the places I could go and the driving time and the quality of the road. Another experience that was, just really interesting, same trip, Google took me different ways from Brian's Head to Bryce Canyon in the going and the returning. And it was a great time of year because I had tons and tons of daylight. So it wasn't getting dark. It was a little sunsetty by the time I was heading back. And one of the things I learned to do after a hike in Kings Canyon some years ago where I really didn't know where I was, I'd gotten on a different trail and the sun was going down and I didn't like the experience. I realized that I could end up places that didn't have a cell signal. So the satellite connectivity of my phone combined with the downloading the maps ahead of time is really helpful. So I downloaded the whole area I was going to be in, and Google took me on these really windy, obscure back roads. It turned into a dirt road for a little while, like huge valleys. And it was a really beautiful route. Like Google came up with a really exquisitely beautiful route. And I really loved getting to see this fertile valley that had all of this openness. It was a truly beautiful, peaceful drive. And in the background, I just kind of had my brain going like, well, this is weird. This is not the way we came. Wow, this seems really deserted. And at the same time, I'm self-coaching like, well, the nice thing is the cell phone that I have has an emergency, satellite text, if something goes horribly wrong. And I'm in a brand new rental car, so probably not a huge risk of anything bad happening, et cetera and so forth. I had a similar experience up in Whitehorse where I went down this really wonderful dirt road to this campground. It was early May, so there was not a soul in sight. And it was really exquisite to get to be close to the river and have these mountains and these vistas and the place all to myself. And again, I was coaching like, okay, even though I don't have a cell signal, I do have the satellite, modern rental car, probably not going to have a mechanical issue. But that's really typical of kind of how I deal with the edge of fear and anxiety and tension. And I think that this is something that could be applied to just about anything that we want to get up to that really kind of moves us out of our comfort zone, because there's a lot of just really cool things that happen when we create new experiences, where we go other places, where we have ability to provide the terrified what if voice in the back of our brain with some adult supervision. And at the same time, one of the things you may take away from this collection of stories, you might take something else, but for me, one of the things that stands out is this balance where I'm hanging with the fear and I'm aware of it and I'm in dialogue with it and I'm watching how intense it becomes, but I'm also not letting it run the show. So I'm not unilaterally overriding fear. I'm paying attention to it and considering carefully and then making really good choices. So when I was up under the stars, I didn't feel like the point at which I went, well, fear's just getting too big and this is uncomfortable and I'm just not enjoying the experience like I could if this wasn't so loud. I've had a good experience. I think I'll go back to the car now. I'm not saying that I was actually in danger or that fear was representing something that was a problem. It was just that I wasn't being successful in that moment and that time of working with my nervous system in a way that would allow me to have the enjoyment and the pleasure and the beauty and the magic of the experience be bigger than the loudness inside of me. And the most elegant way to address that was to come into completion and pivot to the next experience, which was sitting in the car looking out through the windshield. And I know in our culture, I think people get sort of fed up with working with the nuance of themselves and being really present in that way. So we have a lot of popular meme-based wisdom of don't let fear stop you, just push through. And I remember being in a workshop years ago, and I really liked the facilitator who, when she was setting up the expectations and parameters for the experience we're going to have, is saying, I want you to lean into the edge of personal growth, not impale yourself on the point of it. And it was a really specific, move a little past your comfort zone, have some experiences, but don't suddenly just fling yourself so far past that there's, all this really intense stuff that arises. Don't hurt yourself. And I feel like that comes up a lot in the spiritual community. There's a real fascination with these kind of forceful, intense experiences, in service to personal growth. So people might fast for days and days or go on some kind of really intense plant medicine journey. I spent some time with people who had done ayahuasca in Peru day after day after day. They'd had all these back-to-back medicine journeys. And it was interesting because I was seeing them on the other side of it, and I wasn't having an experience of them of oh my goodness, you are so marvelously enlightened. They were kind of just people with all the foibles and dysfunctions that, that humans have. I joined for the non-ayahuasca part of the Peru trip. And I recognize that there's some personal preference in this. So, for example, my cousin loves to race things that go really fast, motorbikes, snowmobiles, four-wheel drive vehicles. And he takes a mountain bike ride and there wasn't a risk of dying. It wasn't an epic enough day. So there are people who just genuinely have a taste for the intensity. But what I find in terms of the demographic of people that I work with, for the most part, that kind of, pushing through for the point of personal growth where you make your body really stressed and afraid and difficult has a lot of pendulum swings and backlash. So it can be really freeing to move into, some other territory. But if you make it too extreme, the pendulum swing back. So if you're like, I'm completely ignoring fear and I'm pushing myself through a whole bunch of fear, and that isn't something that you just genuinely really get a kick out of. So exempting those people, but someone who's telling themselves the story that they should grow by creating a lot of stress, usually there's a lot of backlash and erosion of self-trust and a lot more power struggles and pendulum swings that come out of that. And when I'm working with people in terms of energetic interventions, I can be kind of blunt with the messages from the guides just in the interest of time. Like they're saying this and this and this. And I feel like sometimes people's egos might get a little bit, activated because of the information I'm sharing. But when it comes to the energetic interventions, I have a very light touch. So I can move a lot of energy, bringing back soul parts, doing power retrieval, helping to, move a lot of old kind of karmic ways of relating to family of origin, whatever it might be. But I keep the touch really light. I'm not forcing anything because I want the more resourced and relaxed the person is, the more gently you can extract some of this really old, heavy energy. Whereas if you do this kind of really rough, like, I'm going to break you down until you don't have the resources. And some of those transformational workshops are like, we're going to make sure that you're in too much structure and sleep deprived and don't really kind of get the right amount of food because, then we can have this perceived shift. My experience with that is there's a lot of backlash of the expensiveness on the other side of it. So another travel experience I had, I was having a Puerto Rico experience with my family, and the person I was with really wanted to do something a little bit more extreme than I would have normally done. So we ended up on this thing where they're like, you'll rappel down a cliff and jump off a cliff and into the water, and we'll go into some caves. And it was a really cool trip. I had a genuinely good time. But we got to the rappel down the side of a cliff, and I decided to do it because I looked at the equipment. It looked like, they had a really good system for not dropping tourists on their heads. And it wasn't really that big a distance. And I just wanted to play with the self-efficacy of moving past a point where fear was really high. And so if you've ever rappelled, which again, totally fun for some people, totally not my jam, you basically step backwards into space without really being able to see where you're going. And you're ideally keeping track of what you're doing with some ropes. So it was very stressful. My adrenaline went way through the roof. And I was like, wow, it's really cool that I could do that. And I don't like this flavor of adrenaline in my body. The other person was, glowing with delight at the fun of the experience. And I was like, wow, I really, I'm glad I did that. I did the jump off the cliff into the water too thing. And I'm like, no, not very fun. Glad I could move past that. It was sort of like affirming a range, but then it also really validated staying in the balance where, it's just expensive if your fear spikes up into the really high registers. A bunch of chemistry gets dumped. It can create kind of a detox experience. It can create a lot of fatigue. It can create a lot of aversion. It can erode self-trust. And so it's not to say the people who are, of the Nike just do it are wrong. And I think that there's something that really appeals about that slogan. But when I was in college, one of the brands that was really popular was Say Ow. And it's actually Seau, which was a football player at the time. It was his brand, but not a football follower. I didn't know that. So I thought it was actually a response to the Nike slogan. Because just do it, no matter how scared or stressful or how much it hurts your body. Say ow seems like a reflective outcome of what would happen to people who employed the Nike slogan indiscriminately in terms of their life choices. There would be a lot of saying ow on the other side. And on the flip side, so they're the people who are seeking extreme experiences and ignoring the parts of themselves that doesn't work for, and having some potentially really expensive price tags in the relationship with themselves, in their body's well-being, in these kind of things, without necessarily the gain of spiritual growth or personal growth or health or being more effective in the world. Because if you just like it for its own sake, if you're just like, I just really love chemistry, okay, that's one thing. But if you have the story that somehow you're going to create a more valid experience for yourself, if there's a lot of stress and fear and tension, I think that that's a false premise. I would just really invite you to question it if you're trying to push yourself too far out of your comfort zone. And then on the flip side, there are people who, kind of have much more narrow experiences, who aren't creating a lot of new experiences because their brains go really crazy. And our brains can really be adept at coming up with a rationalization of some random story we heard of. Maybe we read it in a fiction book. Maybe we heard it, with this kind of thing here or there. And our brains are so good at dramatic stories and really bad at statistics. And one of the places this really stood out for me, periodically I'll have accumulated too much stuff. I feel like my belongings are pressing in on me, and I want to get really contemporary with having the things I genuinely want and getting rid of the things I'm keeping out of inertia or habit, or it was a gift and I feel obligated to have taken this thing I didn't really want home with me, or, whatever it is. There are lots and lots of stories attached. But when I start having to really play Tetris to put something away in the closet, it's time, and it'll be like this urge that comes up for me to just go through all the things that I own and release the things that aren't my contemporary truth. And I think that this is a really wonderful thing for energetically sensitive people, because having a contemporary environment helps us to be way more contemporary. It can also be overwhelming because of all the energetic signatures. But the interesting thing is, when you have all those things that you tucked away because it might be useful sometimes, your brain can always come up with a scenario where it would be really good to keep this $5 object that's available with next day shipping on Amazon. That, what if the apocalypse happened? And, it's not to say don't have some emergency supplies. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is our brain can come up with some wildly improbable scenario of something bad happening. I was flying into Iceland, which I love. I just absolutely adore the country. And I was on a plane with, some people who were traveling as couples. And these two older women were asking where I was going. I explained that I was taking a solo trip to Iceland. I was going to go drive around the country and have experiences. And they were like, wow, that's so brave. That's so brave. And to them, it seemed like that. And I really honored that. But at the same time, that balance of experience that I really have a hankering to have versus how much my anxiety or fear gets stirred up. Iceland is a really good balance. It's a developed country. It has a low crime rate. I have always moved through. I've been more than once, and it's just been a really graceful experience of being in the country, and I really, really love it. Now, I would probably hesitate to go down to, say Mexico City alone. And there are probably a bunch of people who, have YouTube videos who are like, I traveled as a solo female traveler and I had a great time. And sure, you just, have these precautions like you would anywhere, and it's totally fine. So we all kind of have our stories and our scenarios, but I think that just sort of monitoring that tension of, yeah, some things are going to get stirred up, but what are the rewards and what's on the other side? And it doesn't mean that travel has to be your bailiwick. It doesn't mean that you have to suddenly embark on solo travel. And there have been things I've backed away from that I, felt really clear about. Again, an Iceland trip where I was tromping to a waterfall and the path was becoming increasingly narrow. Certainly no guide rails. They just don't have guide rails in the countryside of Iceland. And it's a narrow path with a, not particularly insignificant drop down into the river below. And there's some kind of scrambling over rocks. And I'm not really a keen hiker. I haven't spent, every other weekend going on some epic tromp somewhere. So I'm not unreasonable as far as my sure-footedness, but neither is it a skill that I've really developed. And I could hear the waterfall right around the corner, and there was just a little bit more scrabbly path. But in the event that I slipped, it would have been a problem. And the cool thing about Iceland is there are many, many, many beautiful waterfalls, and I was traveling alone, so I could have had a significant problem. So very reluctantly, I backtracked. It probably would have been fine, but for me, just the tension and the risk wasn't the right sort of balance. And so kind of what I'm illuminating here is it doesn't even necessarily matter if you're correct about subjective amount of fear and anxiety. It's just noticing that if we swing ourselves into really high levels of fear and it isn't particularly our jam, we're probably not doing ourselves any favors as far as personal growth. Our system doesn't know that it's not a trauma, but it's a spiritual experience. And sure, there are plenty of systems and people and things that will sell you like, no, this is so transformational, and we can put whatever story around whatever experiences we have. And I get that there's a lot of variety for a lot of people, but when we push ourselves way into the extreme, I think it's expensive as far as our experience, and there tends to be a bit of backlash. And at the same time, if we don't move in a way that creates some tension, if we let our instincts run the show, if when we start to hit that wall of fear, it stops us from doing something that, rationally would probably, statistically speaking, have almost no risk of us perishing. It's reasonably safe, and what reasonably safe represents varies again from person to person. Not trying to tell you how to scale that, but it really limits the aliveness. It limits our brain's ability to fully engage with the world. It doesn't wake up our senses. There can be a loss of engagement in life, a loss of life wish if everything is, the same, and we're really getting most of our stimulation through content. And I like content. I like Facebook. I like Netflix. I like some of the really super cool things that are being created. But I think it's worth noting how different it is. There's a workout program I love. It's called Supernatural, and you can be on a crater next to Iceland listening to 80s music, boxing, or beating things up with bats. And it's a fantastic exercise program. It's been really sustainable and really aligned for me, but it's so not the same, even though you're in virtual reality, 360 degrees, incredibly well rendered, amazing landscape. And I love that I got to, have this Great Wall of China at sunset, 360 degree experience. But energy is so important, and we just really miss out when we aren't having a more complete human experience. In our modern world, we have a lot of white bread. We strip out a lot of the things that go with the grain. And, a lot of people know that whole grains are a lot more supportive for humans. And I think a lot of our modern experiences are a little bit like white bread, where we've stripped things out. And and there's a judiciousness to that. I'm fascinated to watch YouTube videos of people traveling in India, but I just don't think it would be a particularly good match for me, given my level of energetic sensitivity and empathy and a whole lot of factors, even though I can objectively be like, wow, this is really cool. And one of the things I know about myself for traveling is when I get ready for a big trip, the part of me that is super nervous to leave my very comfortable, very aligned home kind of gets stirred up. And so I'll spend a lot of time putting things into suitcases and taking them out and over optimizing and strategizing and making sure I have all the right gear and thinking through possibilities and researching. And I've kind of come to a place of just like, yeah, that's my jam. I'm going to have a little bit of activation when I step into one of these, experiences of leaving my comfort zone. And I think, that one or two steps out of your comfort zone has a lot of merit, rather than people who try to, jump into something wildly different. Again, unless it's your jam, I totally get that there are people who just get a huge kick out of, really, really, really putting themselves in uncomfortable situations. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying if that's not to the taste of your nervous system and you have some idea that that's necessary for growth, you might want to pick something that's more moderate. So someone with social anxiety, I wouldn't encourage them to get a door-to-door salesperson job so that they could be forced to push through and, or, one of those people at the mall who's trying to spray you with perfume. I would give them a lot of strategies for a gentle kind of, well, if you set this up or you set this up or you arrange things this way, or here's some strategies that could make it easier to be in a social situation, so they can build confidence. Because when our emotions and our stress go into the red zone, our executive brain comes offline. We go into fight or flight mode. We go into survival mode. We aren't really necessarily able to be present in other ways. And if you happen to like that chemistry, I would invite you to try out cold plunges, because I happen to be a really big fan, and that'll dump a lot of chemistry. But it's in a lot of ways a lot more attainable and safe and, on the side of your well-being than, perhaps some more extreme things. So there are some other ways you might consider playing with chemistry rather than, creating a feeling of aliveness by genuinely risking your life. My cousin has broken a number of bones in the course of his journey through this. If you couldn't die, it wasn't epic enough approach. But I'm really a fan of a middle path where I can hold space for the part of myself that really wants to have the adventure of hiking to the waterfall or seeing the stars in a really unique environment or opportunity, or having these big experiences, combined with the fact that I have hunter-gatherer biology, and I really don't love the feel of fear and adrenaline. So I don't want my fear to be in the driver's seat, but when it starts to arise, I also haven't found it very functional to barrel past it, to ignore it, to just tell it to shut up, because that can really wind things up. So when I was sitting in the dark under the stars, I was just really aware of the tension between the part of me that was euphoric about this beautiful experience and this part of me that didn't love how far I was out of a comfort zone. Like I had been in that same spot alone with daylight and been completely cool and just really happy that there were no other cars and delighted to hang there. So, there was just the addition of the very, very dark night that really shifted some things for me. And so that honoring both those parts and finding a middle path and making compromises has a lot of elegance to it, and it can come up in a lot of different areas. It can come up in the balance of the part of us that doesn't want to have to do things, wants to have, more freedom and spaciousness and not have a to-do list, and the part of us that knows it would be really responsible to have productivity and make some money and move our bodies, in the appropriate ways. And a lot of people have a lot of being at war with themselves, and that's just a tremendous energy leak when one part of ourself is unilaterally, consistently overruling or bullying the other parts. So you can see this in people who swing back and forth between overfunctioning and underfunctioning. Or people who, the fasting binging would be an example kind of related to food, the life of the party and then isolating. Someone who's really super type A and on task and then, getting really, really, really drunk on the weekend. These are examples of these pendulum swings, and we lose elegance and sustainability and a lot of quality of life and nuance and self-efficacy when we're not having parts of us playing nice together. So there are lots of ways that humans deal with fear, and I would just kind of like to offer some examples of how I move with it in a way that honors just what's true about me at the level of fact. I don't think there's anything to heal or shift or change that would make me not feel a little activated if I'm alone in the woods and the sun is going down, even if realistically it's all going to be totally fine. I don't think there's anything wounded or that needs healing. It's a reality, and working within that reality, I want to, get the most richness out of life, and starting to look at that balance and the holding of the both and can be really supportive for that. So I hope that there's something here that is useful for you in collaborating with yourself, in making deals with yourself, in starting to hear the different parts of you. Whenever we force ourselves past a hell no, there tends to be a backlash on the other side. So if you try to make yourself do something, you're vulnerable to it just not working out at the last minute because of illness. There's a lot of ways that a part of us that's not being heard will go covert. So if you're trying to make yourself take a trip that just isn't the right thing for you, or you haven't worked through some deals about how to take care of yourself, because part of the deal I make with the part of me that's scared to travel is like, look, I'll bring snacks and I'll bring all the layers we could possibly need, and I'll bring this, device so that I could call for help. And I will, I have kind of all this feathering of my mobile nest things that I do that are kind of like the deal and the bargain with myself for the part of myself that, just really kind of wants to stay in the most secure location on the planet. So there's a lot of nuance, and it can apply to a lot of different things, and it can apply to a lot of different emotions. But as I said, I hope there's something here that has value for you. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.